The official story is straightforward. As cities grew during the 19th century, engineers expanded water infrastructure to meet rising demand. Population increased, systems followed. But in 1842, New York City completed the Croton Aqueduct, a 41-mile gravity-fed stone conduit capable of delivering 90 million gallons per day to a city of 312,000 people. That's 288 gallons per person per day. Modern recommended capacity is 100 gallons per person per day. Philadelphia's Fairmount Waterworks, completed in 1815, was designed to pump 3 million gallons daily for a population of 53,000. London's New River, finished in 1613, brought 40 million gallons per day into a city of approximately 200,000. The systems weren't just large. They were early. This is a documentary exploration of observable patterns in historical infrastructure. It does not claim certainty. It examines timing, scale, and engineering decisions that don't always align with the populations they were meant to serve. All claims are sourced from public records, municipal archives, and engineering histories. This is not about conspiracy. It's about architecture that feels older or larger than its official context. The Croton Aqueduct wasn't a temporary solution. It was built from stone, designed to last centuries, and engineered with precision that required surveying technology most assumed didn't exist at scale in the 1840s. The grade dropped 1 foot per mile across 41 miles of terrain. The margin for error was functionally zero. When it opened, New York had fewer than 1/3 of residents. By 1900, the population had grown to over 3 million, yet the Croton system still supplied a significant portion of the city's water. It had been designed, from the beginning, to handle a future that had not yet arrived. This wasn't unique to New York. In 1856, Boston completed the Cochituate Aqueduct, bringing water from Lake Cochituate 14 miles away. The system was designed to serve 200,000 people. At the time of completion, Boston's population was approximately 136,000. The infrastructure preceded the need by nearly 2 decades of growth. Glasgow's Loch Katrine water system, opened in 1859, delivered 50 million gallons per day to a city of 400,000. That's 125 gallons per person. Again, beyond modern recommendations for a 19th century population with no indoor plumbing in most homes. Manchester's Thirlmere Aqueduct, completed in 1894, stretched 96 miles and could deliver 50 million gallons daily. The system was built with such excess capacity that expansions planned for the 1920s were delayed because demand hadn't caught up. The pattern repeats: stone construction, gravity-fed systems, long-distance engineering, and capacity that consistently outpaced the populations being served. These weren't experimental projects. They were civic monuments. The Croton Aqueduct featured the High Bridge, a stone arch structure 1,450 feet long and 140 feet high, designed to carry water across the Harlem River. It still stands. The infrastructure wasn't just functional. It was permanent. Municipal records from the 1840s describe the Croton system as a response to fires and disease, both valid concerns. But the scale of the response raises questions. If the goal was disease prevention, smaller distribution networks would have sufficed. If the goal was fire suppression, localized reservoirs were already in use. The Croton system was designed as if the city already had 1 million people. There's a secondary pattern in the records. These systems were often completed quickly, within 5 to 10 years, using construction techniques that seem advanced for their era. Tunneling through bedrock, surveying across rough terrain, coordinating labor on a scale that required logistical systems we associate with later industrialization. The New River in London, finished in 1613, required the excavation of a channel 10 feet wide and 4 feet deep across nearly 40 miles. That work was completed in 4 years, during a period when England was still recovering from the aftermath of the Elizabethan era and entering the early Stuart period. Labor records describe many hundreds of workers, yet there are few surviving details about how the project was organized or funded at such scale. Some of these systems feel like infrastructure built for a world that hadn't yet materialized. What makes the timing more difficult to reconcile is how little overlap exists between the construction of these systems and the population booms they supposedly anticipated. The Croton Aqueduct opened in 1842. New York's massive population surge didn't begin until the 1880s, nearly 40 years later. Boston's system opened in 1856. The city's industrial explosion came in the 1870s and 80s. The systems weren't reactions. They were preparations, and they weren't isolated. Across the United States and the United Kingdom, major cities built water infrastructure of nearly identical design philosophy during the same 60-year window. Over-engineered, stone-built, gravity-fed, and designed for populations far larger than existed at the time of completion. The coordination wasn't formal, but the pattern was consistent. Some historians argue this reflects forward-thinking civic planning. Others suggest these systems inherited older infrastructure and were merely expanded or rebuilt. A third interpretation, gaining traction in independent historical research, suggests the infrastructure might reflect something else entirely, a label that appears frequently in discussions of unexplained 19th-century construction. The timing, the scale, and the uniformity of these water systems create a friction that official timelines struggle to smooth over. And the deeper you look, the harder it becomes to dismiss as coincidence. The pattern becomes harder to ignore when you map it geographically. Between 1825 and 1870, the United States and the United Kingdom saw the construction of over 40 major aqueduct and reservoir systems, nearly all designed with capacity that exceeded their contemporary populations by 30 to 50%. The systems weren't just large. They followed the same architectural logic. Gravity-fed, stone-lined, multi-decade permanence, minimal reliance on pumping technology, and almost all of them appeared within a single generation. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, is often framed as a transportation project. But it was also a water engineering achievement that required the excavation of 363 miles of channel, the construction of 83 locks, and the coordination of thousands of laborers across terrain that had no existing roads, no railways, and limited surveying infrastructure. The canal was designed to handle barge traffic that didn't yet exist in volume. When it opened, there were fewer than 100 boats registered. Within 5 years, there were over 3,000. The canal had anticipated demand that hadn't materialized at the time of construction. It wasn't alone. Philadelphia's Schuylkill navigation system, completed in 1825, connected the Delaware River to coal regions 108 miles inland. The system included 120 locks and a network of reservoirs designed to regulate water flow year-round. The infrastructure preceded industrial demand by nearly a decade. The Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, begun in 1828, was designed to stretch 184 miles and accommodate traffic volumes that wouldn't emerge until the 1850s. By the time those volumes arrived, the infrastructure was already aging but still functional, suggesting it had been built to last far longer than its immediate use required. These weren't experiments. They were commitments. In the United Kingdom, the same pattern played out with unsettling consistency. Liverpool's water system, completed in 1847, brought water from Rivington Pike, 20 miles away, through a series of reservoirs and aqueducts capable of serving 400,000 people. Liverpool's population at the time was 250,000. The system wasn't expanded until 1880, more than 30 years later, because demand hadn't yet reached capacity. Birmingham's Elon Valley system, completed in 1904 but planned in the 1870s, was designed to deliver 75 million gallons per day across 73 miles of aqueduct and pipeline. The system was built with enough capacity to serve a city of 1.5 million. Birmingham's population in 1904 was just over 500,000. The infrastructure anticipated growth that would take 40 years to arrive. What's more difficult to explain is the administrative uniformity. These systems, built across different nations, different political structures, different funding mechanisms, all followed nearly identical design principles. Stone construction, gravity flow, minimal mechanical reliance, long-distance transport, reservoir networks designed for multi-season regulation. There was no central planning authority, no international engineering body coordinating standards. Yet the systems look like they came from the same blueprint. Municipal archives from the 1840s and 50s describe these projects as civic improvements, responses to cholera outbreaks, fire prevention measures. All valid explanations, but the scale of response consistently exceeds the scale of the problem. London's Metropolitan Water Board, formalized in 1902, inherited a network of systems that had been built piecemeal over 70 years. Yet when engineers surveyed the infrastructure, they noted that most systems had been designed with future capacity in mind, a phrase that appears in records from the 1850s, decades before the population growth that would justify it. There's another element that complicates the timeline: storage. Reservoirs built in the mid-19th century were often far larger than immediate demand required. The Croton system included receiving reservoirs in Central Park and Yorkville capable of holding 150 million gallons, roughly 2 days of supply for the entire city at maximum capacity. Boston's Cochituate system included a distribution reservoir holding 80 million gallons for a city of 136,000 people. That's nearly 6 days of supply, based on 1850s consumption patterns. These weren't emergency stores. They were permanent infrastructure, built into the bedrock of the city, designed as if interruption of supply was assumed to be a long-term risk. Modern water systems aim for 24 to 48 hours of storage. These systems held 4 to 6 days, sometimes more, with no clear explanation in contemporary records as to why. Then there's the rail system. Between 1830 and 1860, the United States laid over 30,000 miles of track. Much of it preceded settlement. In the Midwest, rail lines were built through territories with populations in the hundreds, designed to carry freight volumes that wouldn't exist for another 20 years. The Illinois Central Railroad, chartered in 1851, was granted 2.6 million acres of federal land to build a north-south line through the center of the state. The line was completed in 1856. At the time, much of central Illinois was farmland with scattered towns. The infrastructure preceded the towns. The same pattern appears in the UK. The Great Western Railway, completed in 1841, connected London to Bristol with infrastructure designed for far higher traffic than existed. Isambard Kingdom Brunel's broad gauge track, engineered for speed and capacity, was considered overbuilt by contemporaries. But within 20 years, the system was operating at near capacity. The infrastructure anticipated a future that hadn't yet arrived. And when that future came, the systems were ready. There's a phrase that appears in independent historical research, especially in communities examining 19th century infrastructure: Tartaria's water systems. The term is used to describe infrastructure that feels inherited rather than invented. Systems that seem designed for a scale of civilization that the official population records don't reflect. Whether this reflects forward-thinking urban planning, the reuse of older infrastructure, or something else entirely, the pattern is observable. Water systems, rail networks, and civic architecture built in the mid-19th century consistently exceed the immediate needs of the populations they served. And they do so with a uniformity that's difficult to explain through independent municipal decision-making. The question isn't whether these systems were large. They were. The question is why they were large before they needed to be, and why that pattern repeats across continents with such consistency. The evidence doesn't resolve neatly, but it accumulates. The term Tartaria first appears in European maps during the medieval period as a broad geographic label for the vast regions of Central and Northern Asia. It wasn't a nation. It was a designation, a cartographic convenience for territories that European mapmakers knew little about. By the 19th century, the term had largely disappeared from official use. But in recent years, it has re-emerged in independent historical research as a label for something else, a framework for interpreting infrastructure that feels disconnected from the timeline it's placed within. The modern interpretation of Tartaria isn't about a lost empire. It's about a pattern of construction that suggests inheritance rather than invention. Systems that appear suddenly fully formed, engineered to a standard that exceeds the technological and organizational capacity attributed to the societies that built them. Water systems designed for cities that didn't yet exist. Rail networks laid before the populations arrived. Civic buildings constructed with materials and techniques that required coordination on a scale the historical record struggles to explain. The label Tartaria has become shorthand for this observation. Infrastructure that feels like it was built for a world that came before, or a world that was expected but never fully materialized in the way the architecture suggests. There are 3 primary interpretations of this pattern. The first is conventional. 19th century civic planners were simply forward-thinking. They anticipated growth, invested in permanent infrastructure, and built with a long-term vision that we've since lost in modern construction. The Croton Aqueduct, the Erie Canal, the Elon Valley System, all examples of visionary planning that happened to align across nations during a brief window of civic ambition. This explanation is plausible, but it requires accepting that dozens of independent municipalities, across 2 continents, simultaneously adopted identical engineering philosophies, allocated massive budgets, and executed projects of enormous scale with near-perfect consistency, all without formal coordination. The second interpretation is archaeological. The infrastructure wasn't built from scratch. It was expanded, restored, or repurposed from older systems that existed before the 19th century but left minimal written record. The stone aqueducts, the reservoir networks, the broad-gauge rail beds, all suggest a level of prior development that official histories compress or omit. This interpretation aligns with certain patterns in municipal records. Phrases like rebuilt, restored, and expanded appear frequently in 19th century engineering reports, often without clarification of what preceded the work. The New River in London, completed in 1613, is described in some records as following ancient watercourses. The Croton Aqueduct route was surveyed along paths that some engineers noted were naturally suited to gravity flow, as if the landscape had been prepared. But if older infrastructure existed, where are the records? Why does so much civic construction appear suddenly in the early 19th century with so little documentation of what came before? The third interpretation is the one that the term Tartaria has come to represent. The infrastructure reflects a prior phase of civilization that was more organized, more technically advanced, and more extensive than the historical narrative allows. Not a separate empire, but a different organizational structure. One that left behind architecture but minimal written record, or whose records were absorbed into later national histories without acknowledgement. This interpretation is the most speculative. It requires accepting that large portions of the historical timeline have been compressed, misattributed, or recontextualized in ways that erase continuity. It suggests that the 19th century wasn't an age of invention, but an age of recovery, a period when societies rebuilt systems they had inherited but no longer fully understood. The evidence for this interpretation is circumstantial. The uniformity of design, the speed of construction, the capacity mismatches, the lack of developmental stages in the infrastructure. These observations don't prove the interpretation, but they create space for it. All three interpretations grapple with the same underlying friction. The infrastructure doesn't feel like it emerged organically from the societies that built it. It feels transplanted, inherited, prepared for something larger than what arrived. And that feeling is most acute when you return to the beginning, to the year 1816. 1816 is known in historical records as the year without a summer. Volcanic eruptions in 1815 caused global temperature drops, crop failures, and widespread famine. It's a well-documented climate anomaly. But 1816 also marks the beginning of something else, a sudden coordinated surge in civic infrastructure projects across Europe and North America. Within a decade, major cities began construction on water systems, canals, and rail networks that would define the century. It's as if the world was rebuilding. Not from war, not from conquest, but from something that required large-scale reconstruction of systems that had been disrupted or abandoned. The timing is too precise to ignore, and the scale of what followed is too uniform to dismiss as coincidence. The term Tartaria is a metaphor. It's a way of naming the discomfort that arises when you examine infrastructure that doesn't fit cleanly into the story you've been told. It's not about proving a lost civilization. It's about acknowledging that the 19th century left behind architecture that raises questions the historical record doesn't answer. The water systems are still there. The aqueducts still carry flow. The reservoirs still hold capacity designed for populations that took decades to arrive. The infrastructure remains. And with it, the question, who was it really built for? The evidence invites examination. The patterns suggest inheritance. The timing creates tension. And the scale, the overwhelming, excessive, persistent scale, refuses to resolve.